Picture this. It's the morning of September 19th, 1949. Inside the British Parliament, the air is heavy, suffocating. The Chancellor of the Exchequer rises slowly, a sheet of paper trembling in his hand. Every eye in the chamber fixes on him. He clears his throat and delivers a sentence that will echo across history. The pound sterling is being devalued by 30%. In that single moment, the illusion shattered. The currency that had financed global wars, ruled international trade, and built the mightiest empire in modern history, lost nearly a third of its value overnight. This wasn't policy. This wasn't strategy. It was an admission of defeat. Think about the weight of that moment. The empire that crushed Napoleon, that governed a quarter of the world's surface, that survived 2 world wars at unimaginable cost, now stood exposed before the world as bankrupt. Not weak, not wounded, bankrupt. But here's the part almost no one understands. Britain didn't lose its empire because of battlefield defeats. It wasn't toppled by revolutions in its colonies. It didn't crumble from political upheaval. It collapsed because of something far quieter, far deadlier: debt. Debt hollowed out the empire from within, until one day a chancellor had to stand in front of Parliament and admit the truth no empire ever wants to say: we are broke. And here's the terrifying part. The United States, today's global superpower, is walking down that exact same path. Picture this. The British Empire, painted red across maps, stretched from Africa to Asia, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. People said proudly, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." But here's the secret. Britain's true power wasn't in warships or colonies. It was in pound sterling. This single currency was the bloodstream of world trade. Every contract, every shipment, every loan between nations. Sooner or later, it circled back to London. To hold sterling was to hold power. London wasn't just a city. It was the throne room of global finance. If Paris was culture, if New York was commerce, then London was money itself. Debt, almost nothing. Just 30% of GDP, the legacy of a century of discipline after Napoleon. Britain looked rich, stable, untouchable. Economists later called it exorbitant privilege. What did that mean? It meant Britain could borrow endlessly in its own currency. It meant it could finance wars by printing paper, and the world had no choice but to accept it. It meant Britain was being paid to dominate the globe, its IOUs treated like treasure. From the outside, it looked permanent. But history punishes arrogance, because the higher a power climbs, the more fragile it becomes. And beneath the polished marble of Britain's financial system, cracks were already spreading. So here's the question. Could an empire built on debt survive the century of total war? In 1914, Britain was the banker of the world. Its credit built railways in South America, mines in Africa, ports in Asia. If you needed money, you went to London. But by 1919, just 5 years later, everything had changed. The empire that once lent to everyone now owed money to everyone. The numbers? Shocking. Debt soared from £650 million to £7.7 billion. That's not growth. That's an explosion. 10 times bigger in just 5 years. The deficit hit 150% of GDP. Pause for a second. Imagine the United States today adding $30 trillion of new debt in just 5 years. That's the collapse Britain faced. And the cruel irony, the nation it borrowed from was the one waiting to replace it, America. To fund the war, Britain drained its gold, sold its assets, mortgaged its empire. Every bullet, every battleship, every ration came at the price of dependency. For centuries, London dictated the rules of finance. But after World War I, it was Washington dictating to London. Historians call this moment the beginning of the end. And they're right, because wars don't just drain treasuries, they flip the balance of power. Britain thought it had won the Great War, but in truth, it had mortgaged its future, and the bill would come due sooner than anyone imagined. When the guns of World War I fell silent in 1918, Britain looked victorious. Its armies marched in triumph. Its navy still ruled the seas. Its flag still flew over a quarter of the world. But behind the parades, a darker truth loomed. Britain was drowning in debt. By 1934, more than 15 years after the war, Britain still owed the United States $4.4 billion. Think about that. The interest payments alone were bigger than entire government departments. The math didn't work. The empire couldn't carry the weight anymore, so Britain made a decision that stunned the world. In 1934, it quietly defaulted on its World War I debt to America. And the reaction? Almost nothing. Chancellor Neville Chamberlain joked, "Not a dog barked. No invasion. No sanctions. No collapse." On the surface, it looked painless. But history isn't that simple, because while no dogs barked, the wolves had begun to circle. The default hardened American isolationists. Why should we bail out Europe again? They never repay their debts. It poisoned Washington's politics. And when Hitler rose in Germany, when Europe slid toward chaos, Britain discovered the true cost of that silence. Loans were harder to secure. Sympathy in Congress was scarce. And the empire, once the lender of last resort, now found itself begging. On paper, Britain had won the Great War. In reality, it had mortgaged its future to survive it. And with every passing year, the debt pulled it further down. The weakness was no longer hidden. It was baked into the system. And when the next war came, Britain would face it with no reserves, no safety net, and no choice but to beg. If World War I wounded Britain's finances, World War II finished the job. By 1945, the empire wasn't just struggling, it was bankrupt. The numbers are almost unbelievable. Debt exploded to over 200% of GDP, levels not seen since the Napoleonic Wars. At the peak in 1944, a staggering 55% of GDP went straight to the military. Factories, workers, raw materials, everything was consumed by survival. Exports, once the pride of British industry, had collapsed. Merchant fleets lay at the bottom of the sea. The empire had nothing to sell, and no currency strong enough to buy. Britain survived only on American aid and borrowed time. But here's the cruel twist. The debts weren't just to America, they were to Britain's own colonies. By 1945, Britain owed more than £3 billion in so-called sterling balances. India alone held £1.25 billion. Egypt, £450 million more. For centuries, these lands had been Britain's cash machine. Now, they were its creditors. Imagine the humiliation. The empire that once drained wealth from its colonies was now begging them for mercy. Economist John Maynard Keynes warned, if these debts weren't forgiven, Britain would have no choice but to abandon its empire. And he was right. This wasn't graceful decline. It was desperation. Britain couldn't feed its people without American shipments of food. It couldn't fuel its factories without Canadian loans. The empire was running on borrowed bread, borrowed oil, borrowed dollars. By 1946, Britain was reduced to pleading for the Anglo-American loan, $3.75 billion from the US, $1.9 billion from Canada. But the price? Humiliation. The pound had to be made convertible into dollars. Within a year, reserves collapsed. By 1947, convertibility was suspended, budgets cut, bases abandoned, and the illusion of power was gone. On maps, the empire was still vast. But it was hollow. What Hitler's armies could not destroy, compound interest and debt had already finished. And the next act, the moment Britain would be forced to admit defeat openly, was coming fast. By the late 1940s, the British Empire was living on borrowed time and borrowed dollars. The Anglo-American loan, meant to last 4 years, evaporated in less than 2. Why? Because the conditions were brutal. The pound was forced into convertibility. Any nation holding sterling could demand US dollars in exchange. And the moment that rule took effect in 1947, countries lined up to cash out. Britain's lifeline, its dollar reserves, vanished almost overnight. Think about that humiliation. An empire that once demanded tribute from continents couldn't even defend its own currency. The world smelled blood, and they rushed to collect. By 1949, the crisis couldn't be hidden. Britain had rationed food, slashed spending, abandoned bases, but nothing worked. So Chancellor Stafford Cripps stood before Parliament and admitted the unthinkable. The pound would be devalued by 30%. Overnight. With that single sentence, sterling's reign as the world's reserve currency was over. The illusion of financial dominance shattered. This wasn't defeat by invasion. It wasn't rebellion in the colonies. It was defeat by arithmetic. And the symbolism cut even deeper. When the pound fell, so did Britain's ability to project power. Its military, once feared across oceans, could no longer be financed. Its colonies, already restless, saw the truth. India had broken free in 1947, not because Britain wanted to let go, but because Britain couldn't afford to hold on. That September day was more than an economic policy. It was the moment the mask slipped. The empire that claimed permanence revealed it was mortal, and worse humiliations were coming, because Britain was about to learn a devastating truth. Even military victories mean nothing if America controls the financial lifeline. In 1956, Britain tried to prove, to the world and to itself, that it was still a great power. The stage? The Suez Canal. Not just a waterway in Egypt, the lifeline of empire, the artery of global trade. Whoever controlled Suez controlled oil, goods, and influence. So when Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the canal, Britain saw it as an insult it could not ignore. Alongside France and Israel, it launched a bold strike to seize it back, and at first, it worked. Paratroopers dropped, tanks rolled, the canal was taken. On the battlefield, Britain proved it still had teeth, but then came the blow no general could stop. Not from Cairo, not from Moscow, from Washington. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious, and instead of sending troops, he reached for a far deadlier weapon, money. The U.S. began quietly dumping its massive holdings of sterling, threatening to collapse the British currency. The Bank of England bled reserves at a terrifying pace, $45 million gone in 3 days. At the same time, Washington blocked Britain's access to IMF emergency funds. The message was brutal and clear: withdraw from Egypt, or we will bankrupt you. Think about that. Britain and France had won on the battlefield. Their soldiers stood victorious, and yet, within days, Prime Minister Anthony Eden was forced into a UN ceasefire. Why? Because America made it financially impossible to continue. The Suez Crisis wasn't just a defeat. It was the confirmation that Britain was no longer a true great power. It still had a queen, a flag, an army, but it lacked the one thing that mattered most in the modern age: financial sovereignty. Historians mark Suez as the moment Britain officially slipped into the ranks of second-tier powers. The empire that once dictated the rules of global finance now needed permission to act. And the lesson was brutal. In the 20th century, empires weren't decided by guns and ships alone. They were decided by reserves, currencies, and creditors. And Britain had none left. But the humiliation didn't end in Egypt, because soon Britain would be forced to beg again, this time not from Washington, but from the very institution it had once helped to create, the International Monetary Fund. The humiliation of Suez should have been the end, but Britain's decline wasn't one dramatic fall. It was a long, grinding descent. By the mid-1970s, Britain was staggering. Inflation was out of control. The pound was in free fall. Investors were fleeing. And in 1976, Prime Minister James Callaghan was forced to do the unthinkable: go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund. The request? £2.3 billion. The largest loan ever asked of the IMF at that time. But money never comes free. The IMF demanded brutal austerity, cuts to spending, reductions in social programs, economic policy dictated not from Westminster, but from Washington. For a nation that once ruled a quarter of the world, it was the ultimate humiliation. The empire that once financed others now had to be told how to run its own economy. And the indignities didn't stop there. The shadow of debt from World War II still hung over Britain. Payment after payment, year after year, the loans from the 1940s chained the empire long after its power was gone, until finally, on December 29, 2006, Britain made its last repayment, $83 million to the US, $23.6 million to Canada. With interest, Britain had repaid almost double what it borrowed. Think about that. The empire that once declared itself eternal spent 6 decades paying for a war it supposedly won. The victory was hollow, the cost catastrophic. The financial chains lasted longer than the empire itself. This was the final insult. Not a glorious last stand, not a dramatic collapse, but the slow, humiliating erosion of sovereignty, from creditor of the world to dependent of the IMF. And as Britain slipped into the role of a second-tier power, a new empire rose, one that seemed untouchable, unstoppable, destined to rule global finance, the United States. But here's the question: is America truly different? Or is it simply walking the same road Britain walked, only a few decades behind? When Britain's empire collapsed under the weight of debt, a new empire stepped forward, the United States. For decades, America believed its position was permanent, that the dollar would always dominate, that its military could always enforce order. But history whispers a darker truth, one that feels disturbingly familiar. Start with the debt. By 1945, Britain's debt was over 200% of GDP. Interest consumed half the budget. Today, America owes $33 trillion, 130% of GDP and climbing. In 2024, Washington spent more on interest than on defense. Britain crossed that line in the 1940s. It was the beginning of the end. Now the military. Britain's empire demanded garrisons from Egypt to Singapore. It couldn't pay for them. Today, America runs 865 bases worldwide. Nearly $1 trillion a year on its military. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, $8 trillion. Like Britain, America is trying to police the globe, with money it doesn't have. Reserve currency? Sterling once ruled trade, until creditors lost faith. Between 1944 and 1949, the pound collapsed. Today, the dollar's share of global reserves has slipped from 72% to 59%. China, Russia, BRICS, building alternatives. Sanctions meant to strengthen the dollar are now pushing nations away from it. And creditors. Britain had to beg America for loans. Those loans destroyed its independence. Today, America itself is the debtor. China alone holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. Foreign creditors, $7.7 trillion. If they sell together, America's position unravels overnight. There's even a name for this: Ferguson's Law. When a superpower spends more on interest than on defense, decline is inevitable. That's exactly where America stands in 2024. So ask yourself, is this time truly different? Or are we just watching Britain's slow-motion collapse replayed, this time written in dollars instead of pounds? Because if history rhymes, then the United States is already past the halfway point. This isn't just about history, it's about you. When Britain devalued the pound in 1949, ordinary people woke up 30% poorer overnight. Their savings bought less, their wages shrank, their futures were stolen. And remember, Britain was still a victorious empire at the time. If the dollar loses its dominance, the same will happen in America. Your savings, your retirement funds, your investments in dollars, all at risk of being slashed in value. Prices will rise, living standards will fall. Independence itself will be compromised, as Washington becomes dependent on foreign creditors. Collapse isn't abstract. It's not something that happens to nations in textbooks. It happens to people, to families, to you. The only real question is simple. When the reckoning comes, will you be prepared or blindsided? Empires don't die in glorious battles. They die in silence, under the weight of debt, until one day the mask slips and the illusion is gone. Britain thought it was different, permanent, too powerful to fail. It was wrong. And today, America tells itself the same story. But history doesn't bend for empires. The laws of money, debt, and power never change. So the real question is this: will the United States reform before it's too late? Or will it face its own 1949 moment? Because when collapse comes, it comes suddenly, and those who are unprepared pay the price. If you want more untold stories of money, power, and collapse, make sure you subscribe, because history is repeating, and you need to see it before it hits you. If this opened your eyes, hit subscribe. Every day, we reveal the hidden lessons of financial history.